Today is Friday, April 23rd, 2021, and you are listening to the 69th broadcast of TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. My name's Dr. Ed DeVries. I am a contributing editor at TBR Magazine, the Barnes Review magazine, and for the next hour, I will be your host and guide here on the TBR History Hour. Today, I want to talk about UFOs. Most people familiar with the subject of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, will tell you that the first alleged crash of an extraterrestrial craft occurred near Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947. Even individuals who've studied the phenomenon, few are aware that Roswell was not the first case of its kind. In fact, it was preceded by at least a dozen similar, lesser-known incidents just in this country alone. For example, in 1924, local residents observed a strange object flying erratically overhead before impacting the ground in a wooded area near Gem, West Virginia. That's in Braxton County, about 35 miles southwest of Clarksburg. When the search party reached the scene, they were surprised to find a curious-looking group of individuals already at the site. One of the searchers later recalled that there were 5 or 6 men in the clearing. Some of them were dressed in black business suits, neckties, and that seemed damn silly in that part of the woods. Others, they said, were dressed in coveralls of a funny color made of some kind of a shiny material, and they were talking among themselves in a rapid-fire foreign language, and they got really excited when they saw the local investigators. The men in coveralls ran into the wreck like they were trying to hide, and the strangers, they said, were small, just a little over 5 feet tall, and looked like Orientals with high cheekbones and slant eyes and dark skin. One of them, they said, spoke English with a very peculiar accent and told them that nobody was hurt and that everything was all right and that he would call the sheriff later and make a full report. Of course, he never did call the sheriff later. And there wasn't much that these investigators could do, or that the sheriff even could have done, because no crime had been committed and nobody was hurt. And so they went away, leaving the foreigners to fuss with their contraption. They said it didn't look much like a flying machine. In fact, they said it was a wonder that it could fly at all. It was a fuselage that looked like an airplane, and it even had windows, but they said it didn't have any wings or a tail or propellers. And they said it was huge, maybe 75 feet long, and of course there were no 75-foot-long airplanes back in 1924. But the strange craft apparently wasn't too badly damaged, because the witness said that a couple of days later they went back and found the clearing empty, and the grass and the bushes were crushed down where the airplane had been, but there was no sign of anything or anybody. The farmer who owned the field said he had seen some lights in the sky the next night and thought that the thing had taken off. The following year, which was 1925, a noisy mystery craft apparently crashed to the earth in a remote area in Montana near Polson. The incident was observed by a local woman and her young son. According to the son's recollection years later, they heard a pulsating, roaring noise and looked up to see a flaming circular object, maybe 200 feet or more in diameter, descending at a speed that they estimated to be approximately 700 to 1,000 miles per hour. They said it was about 5 miles away, and that the object was revolving at a rate of about 2 turns per second, and seemed to hesitate and move approximately 1 meter to the north before it continued its descent. This witness added that he observed what looked like pieces of debris coming from the object. However, he said that there was no fiery trail following the object, as would be expected if it were a meteor. And so whatever it was, it gave off a brilliant white flash when it apparently impacted behind a nearby mountain. The witness heard no noise and felt no shockwave, and several individuals later reported discovering a large burnt area of ground where the object was believed to have gone down, but there was no sign of the craft itself. According to the family of a respected Ohio minister, the U.S. government came into possession of a crashed UFO sometime prior to 1939. The source of this information was said to be Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, a close friend of the minister. Years later, the minister's daughter revealed the UFO to a UFO study group. One day when my father was in Washington, she said, Cordell swore to him secrecy and took him to a sub-basement in the U.S. Capitol building and showed him an amazing sight. 4 large glass jars holding 4 creatures unknown to my father, an erect round craft of some kind nearby. Cordell said they were afraid they would start a panic if the public found out about it. The creatures were said to have been less than 4 feet tall. The vehicle, described as being in pieces, was silver-colored and metallic. The Office of the Capitol Architect recently confirmed that there had in fact been a sub-basement with storage rooms in the building in 1939. Before World War II, there were very few military bases or other secure government facilities suitable for storing such an acquisition. Then in 1941, details of an alleged UFO crash near Cape Girardeau, Missouri came. The following is a recounting of the incident by the granddaughter of a local minister who was taken by police to the site of what was assumed to be an airplane crash. He said they drove out to maybe 13, 15 miles or so out of town. They parked the cars on the side of the road. They walked a quarter of a mile or so into a field, and they saw a fire burning. She said her grandfather told her that it wasn't an airplane or like any craft he'd ever seen. It was broken and scattered all around, but one large piece was still together, and it appeared to have a rounded shape with no edges or seams, and it had a very shiny metallic finish. She said you could see inside one section and see what looked like a metal chair with a panel and many dials and gauges, none, however, familiar looking to the minister. He said that when he got there, men were already sifting through things. There were police officers, plainclothes people, and military men. There were 3 bodies, not human, that had been taken from the wreckage and laid on the ground. She said her grandfather said prayers over them. So he got a close look, but he didn't touch them. And he didn't know what had killed them. They didn't appear to have any injuries, and they weren't burnt. He said it was hard for him to tell if they had on suits or if it was their skin, but they were covered head to foot in what looked like wrinkled aluminum foil. He could see no hair on their bodies, and they had no ears. They were small framed like a child, about 4 foot tall, but had larger heads and longer arms. They had very large oval-shaped eyes, no noses, just holes, no lips, just small slits for mouths. And this woman said that a military officer at the scene told her grandfather not to discuss the incident for security reasons. Another witness, a firefighter, said he observed hieroglyphics in the interior of the craft. The Air Force reportedly tried to replicate the Cape Girardeau craft with the help of former Third Reich scientists after World War II, and at least a dozen models were built and flown secretly, but they proved difficult to handle in flight. In fact, 5 test pilots were killed on the project, and it was eventually canceled. The next year, 1942, there was a couple living on a farm in Toa Alto, Puerto Rico, and they were awakened one night by a deafening noise. Their experience, which they would recount years later by their grandson, who got it from his mother, who was a young girl at the time of the incident, said that my grandparents and mother heard an explosion and felt a sudden rise of heat. They ran to the window and saw what they thought was a meteorite. They waited until the morning. When they went out to see the object, there was white smoke coming out of the middle of it. The object was approximately 16 foot in diameter. The color was light gray metal with a marble-like texture. The center of the object was hollow where the smoke was coming out. It seemed that something was missing from the center. After a while, the military came with trucks. The military men spoke with my grandparents. I really don't know what was said at that point. My mother was told to leave the room. The military left with the object. The object left a black mark on the grass. My grandmother stated before she passed away that the craft had beings not from Earth. A couple of years later, in Belfast, Maine, in 1945, there was another, what appears to be controlled UFO crash, when a hunter watched a strange, elongated object fly slowly overhead at a downward angle before plunging into some woods. The craft, which the man said was huge, remained on the ground for only a short time. The witnesses observed it lift off with a humming noise, begin to rotate, and then emit a shower of silver thread-like substance. There are other similar discharges in more recent UFO cases that have been dubbed as quote-unquote angel hair for their resemblance to the Christmas tree decorating material of that name. But this hunter said in 1945 that it rose straight up and disappeared from the view in just a matter of seconds. Of course, the state of New Mexico seems to have been the hotbed for UFO crashes, even before Roswell. According to a former U.S. Army enlisted man who claimed to have been a member of an inter-service military team tasked with recovering downed UFOs, New Mexico was the only state in the Union that had its own file because there was so much going on. It was several hundred pages in length. One theory for why there were so many crashes in Roswell, or rather should I say in New Mexico, is that in that area, in the New Mexico area, there are a lot of military radars, and they would throw off the UFO's guidance system. Apparent confirmation of that theory was contained in a 1950 memo from an FBI agent to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And the investigator for the Air Force stated that 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. They were described as being circular in shape with ray centers and approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape, but only 3 feet tall and dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body was bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits used by speed flyers and test pilots. The saucers were found in New Mexico due to the fact that the government has a very high-powered radar setup, and it is believed that the radar interferes with the controlling mechanism of the saucers. Again, that was in a UFO memo to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover back in 1950. It's said that back in 1947 that J. Edgar Hoover penned a few days after the Roswell recovery, quote unquote, "The Army grabbed it and would not let us have it for cursory examination," unquote. So apparently, even before the military was investigating these UFOs, apparently the FBI was. In 1945, there were 2 boys, ages 7 and 9, and they were looking for a stray cow near San Antonio, New Mexico. They hear a loud noise that they think is a bomb exploding. The ground shook. They looked around. They saw smoke coming from a couple of canyons down. And so they approached the smoke. They reached the ridge, and they could see what appeared to be a big gouge in the ground. They were looking through binoculars and could see the hole on the side of the object being avocado-shaped. Looking through the binoculars, they saw little creatures moving back and forth, maybe like they were sliding. They said it was about 200 feet from us. When interviewed years later as witnesses, these boys would say they still had a vivid memory of the craft's occupants. Their heads, they said, looked like a praying mantis with big bulging eyes, 4 foot tall, maybe really thin, needle-thin arms. Because the object had crashed on property belonging to the family of one of the boys, the father was approached by a member of the military. He said, quote, "I'm with the U.S. Army and I need permission from you to cut the fence and put in a gate because one of our experimental weather balloons inadvertently fell on your property," unquote. A short time later, the boys witnessed the military recovering the object. Quote, "First they would bring in some road building equipment, build a gate, bring in a semi-truck with a lowboy trailer, build a frame on the trailer, bring in a crane and load the craft onto the tractor trailer," unquote. Most of the accounts of the Roswell incident say that the wreckage of the crashed craft and the bodies of the crew were flown to Wright Field, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. In June of 1946, a young boy visiting his father on the base claimed he caught a glimpse of something incredible through a partially open hangar door. He said it was a domed, saucer-shaped craft approximately 20 feet in diameter, sitting on 3 legs. Next to the craft, he said there were 3 or 4 small humanoid bodies on stretchers, and the dead creatures were brownish-colored and had disproportionately large pear-shaped heads. A colonel noticed the boy looking through the door, and a short time later, the boy's father lost his job. The boy's grandfather, who was also a civilian employee at the base, reportedly confirmed that a UFO had been brought there. A few months later, it would have been either October or November 1946, a saucer-shaped UFO reportedly recovered somewhere in Arkansas was transported to Wright Field. Around that time, a former airman at the base claimed he examined an object resembling 2 soup bowls joined at the rim inside a hangar. He estimated the craft was 15 foot in diameter and 7 foot thick, with a series of rectangular windows around its circumference. The strange craft, which bore no markings of any kind, appeared to be molded of one continuous material resembling brushed aluminum. The witnesses got only a brief glimpse of the UFO's interior. He said it was empty except for a cylinder about 3 foot in diameter in the center of the floor. The details are sketchy, but there were other UFO crashes that also occurred in New Mexico and Arizona in 1946, 1947. One particular incident began when 3 employees of a construction company went to investigate a loud explosion nearby and found the smoking wreckage of a strange aircraft unlike anything they had ever seen before. The witnesses also claimed to have seen 3 small humanoid creatures outside the object. One of them was apparently injured, and the 3 men said they were taken to a nearby building and interrogated by several individuals who told them they had witnessed a secret government project and ordered them not to talk about what they had seen. 2 other witnesses were sent packing when they chanced upon the scene of a crashed UFO in Arizona in 1947. One of those was a U.S. Navy enlisted man, and the other had been recently discharged from the Army. They were driving on the Papago Reservation near Globe when they came upon the remarkable scene. Half buried in the sand was a disc-shaped object about 30 foot in diameter and 18 foot thick. It had a dome on top and windows or portholes around its rim. That's all the pair had time to observe before the military personnel at the scene ordered them to continue along on their way. 6 months later, something would drop from the sky, skid across the ground, and come to rest in a field near Roswell. And of course, that incident has since been enshrined, erroneously as it turns out, in UFO lore as the first crash of an extraterrestrial craft in the United States. If not for the fact that an overzealous commander at the nearby Roswell Army Air Force Base ordered the release of the story to a local newspaper and radio station without first checking with higher headquarters, the Roswell event would have almost certainly become just as unknown as the other incidents which I've recounted to you in today's broadcast. If you want to learn more about noteworthy pre-Roswell UFO crashes that occurred outside of the United States, go to the March-April 2017 issue of TBR Magazine and read the article, Shooting for the Stars. And on that note, here's a brief word from our sponsor, The Barnes Review. We'll be back in 45 seconds.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Way back in 1977, I was a 5-year-old boy and I saw the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Remember? It's the first movie that I remember watching in the movie theater. I'd be a teenager before those same 5 musical notes. Re, mi, do, do, so. The second do is an octave below the first. But I'd be a teenager before those notes stopped running through my mind, just as they had in the character Roy Neary's throughout the movie. 2 years later, I thought I saw a UFO. This was 1979, and I was a 7-year-old. Again, nobody believed me. By the way, at the same year, then President Jimmy Carter also believed he saw a UFO, and nobody believed him either. I have a third cousin. He was astronaut Frank Borman. He reported seeing an alien spacecraft from his Gemini 7 capsule. Good luck, by the way, finding an official report on that one, and yes, I have tried to do so. There's not one. But like the president and our family's resident astronaut, I knew what I saw. At least I thought I did. The experience, to say the least, was enough to initiate a lifelong fascination. Likewise, Carter and Borman were struck by a similar experience-related fascination that was even more intense than my own. Some 30 years later, I was offered a job as the interim pastor, and I lived for almost a year in Roswell, New Mexico. Let's just say that I didn't jump at the opportunity, I leapt at it. Having spent several decades reading and studying about UFOs, and with almost a year's worth of dedicated research while living in Roswell, reading the archived reports and in many cases interviewing the actual people whose names I encountered in those reports or their children, I was able to determine the following to be facts of what actually happened in Roswell. The first fact: in 1947, an unusual aircraft crashed in the desert of New Mexico. The second fact: the Roswell Army Air Base was involved in recovering the unidentified craft and possibly bodies. Reported numbers have varied over the years as to how many bodies there were, but there were bodies. On July 8th of 1947, the Roswell Daily Record newspaper published a front-page story taken from the official press release written by Lieutenant Walter Haut of the Roswell Army Airfield's 509th. He was acting under orders of Colonel William Blanchard. The headline read, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." The fourth fact being, following orders from Colonel Blanchard and probably General Roger Ramey and higher-ups in Washington, D.C., Lieutenant Haut retracted his original flying disc press release and claimed in the next day's newspaper that it was just a weather balloon. The next fact being that the Air Force still maintains its weather balloon story even to this day. They did add a small detail to it, adding about crash test dummies in the 1997 official Roswell Case Closed report, which was released just 2 weeks before the event's 50th anniversary. Another fact is that at the time, in July 1947, the media and the public, quote-unquote, bought the weather balloon story. But in coming years, too many witnesses would surface recounting their stories and talking about how they received death threats. While the government insisted on maintaining the official story, almost no one believes it, proving to many that the weather balloon story was just a cover-up. And the final fact being nearly indisputable to all investigation, is that for whatever reason, the government has been lying for going on 70 plus years, and what crashed and what was recovered from the desert outside of Roswell, we don't know. All we know is the government lies about it. Beyond those facts, all of my other conclusions and all of the countless other researchers and writers, their conclusions is just speculation. Many believe that the wreckage and bodies recovered in Roswell are otherworldly. In other words, they were that of a spacecraft and its extraterrestrial pilots. Others, while not believing the government's cover story, consider the entire matter to have been a terrestrial event. In other words, no aliens, all of it can be explained as technology and creatures originating somewhere on our own planet Earth. As someone who had seen a UFO, I began my research as one seeking proof of the extraterrestrial. At the same time, my study of World War II, and yes, it's possible to maintain completely separate interests and to pursue them at the same time. It's kind of like walking and chewing gum while listening to music at the same time. You can do it. And these two studies of UFOs in World War II brought me to some really fascinating information about the German space program. Specifically, that the Germans had developed jet and rocket engines way before the Allies did. The Nazis had even launched experimental saucer-like craft from secret bases near the South Pole, a location chosen because the Earth's magnetic pull in the polar area made it easier to get the saucers off the ground and into a low Earth orbit. The same Nazi scientists who had worked in the German space and rocket programs would, after the war, move to the United States or the former Soviet Union, where they would continue their experiments. It would be Werner von Braun, the Nazi scientist who would build America's NASA on the foundation of the Nazi space and rocket program. While I was fascinated with both subjects, that being UFOs and the Nazis, proving the cover-up of extraterrestrial life at Roswell and learning more about the terrestrial history of the Nazi and U.S. space programs, I never imagined that the two were so intimately intertwined. That was until I met and became friends with renowned Roswell ufologist Guy Malone. In fact, I'd interviewed Guy Malone on my radio show, TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, back in August of 2018. But I met Guy back in 2008 when I was living in Roswell, New Mexico. Guy had told about how, when he was a child, he thought himself to have been abducted by aliens, and that began his lifelong fascination with the subject. In the first of our two radio conversations, we spoke at length about what really happened at Roswell, New Mexico back in 1947. Our explanations, far from what you'd expect from a couple of kids who had seen UFOs, or in Guy's case, was actually abducted by aliens, who, by the way, were entirely terrestrial. If you were to go to Guy's website, or if you were to read Guy's research, you would see that what he originally thought was an alien abduction turned out to be a encounter with demons. But anyways, back to the UFO that crashed in the desert outside of Roswell. Let's just say that it probably was not an alien craft at all. Or to be more accurate, a UFO probably skipped near Roswell, leaving debris, and again regained altitude and finally crashed in Corona, New Mexico, about 45 or 50 miles as the crow flies from the crash site near Roswell. Another possibility is that two aircraft crashed in different locations. Books such as Stanton Friedman's Crash at Corona and Randall and Schmidt's UFO Crash at Roswell are good places to start your investigation of that matter. But I spent a lot of time at the International UFO Museum and Research Center. It opened in Roswell back in 1991. It was founded by retired Lieutenant Walter Haut, of all people, the author of the original government cover-up. Why? Because Lieutenant Haut never bought his own cover story. And I must report that Haut is a believer in extraterrestrials. That belief underlines all of the International UFO Museum and Research Center's publications and research. I mention him and the UFO Museum and Research Center because he's done an excellent job of documenting and cataloging eyewitness testimony from the actual people living in and working around Roswell at the time of the crash. He has also collected and cataloged, as they've become declassified and become more available, all relevant military and government documents pertaining to the Roswell incident. The International UFO Museum and Research Center sees over 200,000 visitors annually. Many people witnessed the plummeting to the earth of the unusual craft on that stormy night in early July 1947. And the Museum and Research Center has collected all of the testimony and collated it into a working narrative which we can then examine and explain. And according to most testimony, the Roswell incident begins when ranch hand Mac Brazel drives into town, bringing pieces of debris to then Roswell Sheriff George Wilcox. The metal was said to have unusual properties. In fact, I had the opportunity to play with a piece of this metal. And it's amazing. It doesn't matter what shape you put it in. It will always revert to its original shape. Imagine a magic tinfoil, if you will. You crumble it up into a ball, you toss it on the table, and then it lays itself out flat again. At the time, it was well known that Roswell's 509th Division was where our nation's then 15 atomic bombs were stored, along with the only planes equipped to fly and deliver the bombs and the only pilots trained to release them. Roswell was also the world's largest air landing strip at the time. Major Jesse Marcel receives Sheriff Wilcox's phone call. Wilcox asked if the 509th had lost any planes. They had not. Major Marcel and the less reported Sheridan Cavett, who was a counterintelligence officer already assigned to the case, respond and visit the crash site. Why? If the Army had no idea anything had happened or what they'd find, would a counterintelligence officer have already been assigned to accompany Major Marcel and Mac Brazel to the debris field? Anyway, as the story goes, truckloads of debris were soon brought to a now famous Hangar 84, along with the bodies, and the quote-unquote flying saucer press release was issued. The first night, Lieutenant Marcel kept some debris and woke up his wife and young son and showed it to him. They were certain that they had a piece of a flying saucer, but later young Jesse Jr. returned to the debris and ultimately surrendered to the cover-up. As Roswell came to international attention overnight, the debris and the bodies were flown to other military bases, including Fort Worth, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, and all of the wreckage was eventually confiscated and orders were given to all involved to remain silent forever. Mac Brazel managed to slip away from his military escorts and record a radio interview. Immediately, the station's owner was contacted by government officials and told he would lose his FCC license if he broadcast it. Also, according to the museum, Brazel's friends, they were Walt Whitmore and Lynn Strickland. They saw their friends being escorted to the Roswell Daily Record by 3 military officers. He ignored Whitmore and Strickland, which was not at all like himself, and once he got to the newspaper office, he changed his story. Now he claimed to have found the debris on June 14th, despite the media's apparent compliance with the cover-up. The Roswell Daily Record does seem to get in one final zing. As the last words of their July 9th article were, Brazel said that he had previously found 2 weather observation balloons, but that what he found at the time did not in any way resemble either of these. I'm sure that what I found was not any weather observation balloon, he told the paper. But if I find anything else besides a bomb, they are going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it. Anyways, Brazel then disappeared for several days. Was he under house arrest? Was he being brainwashed? Was he under threat? And he never spoke of the incident again. But he is said to have been seen driving around town immediately after his reappearance with a new truck, which he could have never afforded. And so the locals in Roswell were always suspicious. Another Roswell resident, funeral homeowner Glenn Dennis, says that he received a phone call from the 509th asking for child-sized, hermetically sealed caskets and instructions on how to preserve the tissue of corpses for further study. And so something crashed. Having never seen a flying saucer-like aircraft and not knowing what their own government was experimenting with and on at the time, the witnesses, even the military witnesses, equally ignorant of the activities of other military agents, assumed an extraterrestrial explanation. And that's why they were agreeable to participate, as they did for so many years, in a cover-up. Others completely dismiss the conspiracy theory altogether, believing that our government is simply too inept to have kept such a good secret. The Manhattan Project suggests otherwise, however. During World War II, the United States government involved hundreds of scientists and military personnel in one of the best-kept top secrets of the world. Some reports say that up to 10,000 people were involved on a need-to-know basis in the Manhattan Project, and nobody knew that the Manhattan Project's secret laboratories were in, of all places, New Mexico during that time. Everything remained a secret until the bombs were dropped. When the war was over, the government still had those ultra-top secret bases in New Mexico, complete with scientists, labs, everything. What were they going to do with them? And so what follows is the bomb that the U.S. military never dropped. We'll call this Operation Paperclip. We know about it today, just as we know of the Manhattan Project. But in 1947, nobody knew about Operation Paperclip. Before and during World War II, the Nazis were working on flying discs. German and American soldiers alike referred to them as, quote-unquote, Foo Fighters. Mysterious red and silver balls of fire which followed Allied planes at speeds of 300 miles an hour. German soldiers reported them as well, also unsure of what they were. Then there were reports that Victor Schauberger produced a saucer-shaped flying machine. It used a liquid vortex propulsion system. His theory was that if water or air is rotated into a twisting form of oscillation known as a colloidal, a buildup of energy would result with immense power that would cause levitation. In a letter to his friend, Schauberger claims that the full-size prototype of one of his designs was constructed using prison labor at the Mannhausen concentration camp. This craft flew on February 19th, 1945 near Prague, and it obtained an altitude of 45,000 feet in only 3 minutes. The letter goes on to say the prototype was destroyed by the Nazis before it could be captured by the Allies. So, cutting to the chase, Operation Paperclip was a formerly classified, that was until 1973, top secret project in which the American government secretly smuggled at least 126 Nazi scientists into the United States after the war. Let's just say we know of 126. There were probably more. The OSS, which is now known as the CIA, cleaned up their records because President Truman did not want to let true Nazis into the country, much less put them on the payroll. But he did because he wanted to develop the Nazi space technology before the Soviets did. Operation Paperclip is now so old that at least some of its secrets are no longer classified, including that Nazis, Dr. Werner von Braun, the German scientist who would become one of the leaders in building NASA. Anyway, back in 1947, for nearly 20 more years, Operation Paperclip was a secret. It was as discreet as the Manhattan Project had ever been. The general public would be outraged, especially in post-World War II America, had they known that 126 Nazis were actively working in the New Mexico desert. And there's no amount of spin doctoring that would have made that situation acceptable to the American public, were they to discover what those evil geniuses were actually working on. And not only were the Nazis now working for the U.S. Army, they were working on flying saucers, and worse, they were experimenting on human children. Which is why the UFO crashes of the 1940s and 50s include accounts of child-sized bodies. These bodies were believed to be alien. They were most likely, however, those of human children who were suffering from a condition called progeria. Look up progeria, Progeria. Look up progeria on Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo. Progeria results in the rapid aging of children, beginning with growth failure during the first year of life that results in disproportionately small bodies given the size of their heads. The children are thin with baldness, wide and narrow faces, and old-appearing skin. Children with progeria develop early atherosclerosis. The average lifespan for these children with progeria is in their early teens. Children with progeria usually have dwarf-like frames, bald heads, pinched noses, and large heads with a small face, prominent eyes, and wrinkled skin. There's a total disappearance of cheek fat with sharpening of facial features and diminished growth. When you type progeria into Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo, click on images, and you'll see pictures of children with progeria. They look very similar to what we would consider images of space aliens. Progeria is extremely rare. The Nazi scientists were experimenting on its victims before and during the war. After the war, those same scientists came to the United States. They were in New Mexico in secret laboratories under the umbrella of Operation Paperclip. They continued their experiments. At least 3 other UFO crashes were reported and their wreckage recovered in New Mexico between 1947 and the early 1950s. There were probably more that we never heard of. Despite the protocol that was established in 1947 to ensure that no such wrecks would ever make major headlines again, at least 3 made the local news, the biggest of which occurred in 1948 in Aztec. Today, Aztec has a budding UFO tourism industry, and its annual UFO conference even rivals that of Roswell's. At the Aztec crash, they recovered 16 bodies. By the way, did you catch the reference a moment ago to human experimentation? In short, UFOs were not being covered up. UFOs were the cover-up. While all the popular books about Roswell are written by researchers and not eyewitnesses, eyewitness Robert Shirky has written a pamphlet. It was titled, "What Will Happen When We Are Gone?" In it, he says someone is trying to confuse the public. In the not-too-distant future, we white hairs and bald heads are not going to be here. Shortly, the federal government and its generals will be able to say anything without fear of contradiction about UFOs and alien people flying strange crafts. No one will be alive to counter their falsehood with the statement, "But I was there." I guess that's why Shirley later titled his book, "I Was There." He and Frank Kaufman, who would later be outed by researchers Randall and Smith as a military intelligence officer discharged after the Roswell incident but covertly reassigned to work for 30 years at the Roswell Chamber of Commerce as a civilian spy, produced a video called "We Were There." Together, they tell the story of how the two men participated in the retrieval of the craft and the cover-up. I'd be remiss if I did not mention that at the end of their presentations, both Shirky and Kaufman go out of their way to express their belief in God and the Bible, a faith both say grounded them while facing truth that drove many of their peers to depression, insanity, and suicide. Shirky and Kaufman saw the bodies, and their descriptions of them match those who would suffer from progeria. Describing our government's experimentation on children with progeria in his Roswell 1947 What Really Happened book, ufologist Guy Malone writes, "As I write this, I've never hoped I was wrong more in my entire life. Paperclip's clandestine history of human experimentation is well documented. For now, I will let the unspeakable remain unspoken, but you can do the math. Society's undesirable kids living in hospitals and institutions, not expected to live past age 12 to 15. Nazis on U.S. soil, testing craft of never-before-achieved speeds, which to date had previously been only remote-controlled. You can just imagine." What does the Bible say in Ecclesiastes 12:14? "For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil." Has God used ufologist Guy Malone to bring to light the evil that was Project Paperclip? Ufologist Nick Redfern, author of Cosmic Crashes, would later write to Guy Malone and say this: "I would agree with you that the possibility that the Roswell bodies were human is a very real one, and is one that regrettably very few researchers are looking into. There was a book being planned on this by two authors that was to be titled Iceman Down, but I think it was shelved. But I would definitely say that more research should be done in this area, particularly regarding Operation Paperclip." Tim Cooper, a researcher now retired, did an interview several years ago, a former U.S. military nurse who told him that small and unusual bodies were being flown to Los Alamos from 1945 to 1947 by the military, and the rumor was that they had been used in biowarfare and nuclear experimentation in Japan during the war and had been found by U.S. forces after Japan was defeated. That was the end of Nick Redfern, author of Cosmic Crashes, letter to Guy Malone. The witnesses of Roswell knew absolutely nothing about progeria, and even less about the potential of mutilated radioactive World War II survivors. They had no knowledge of Operation Paperclip. They could never have imagined the evil atrocities that their government was capable of. And so they truly believed that the bodies they had seen being charred and nothing like anyone they had ever seen before were extraterrestrial. And this worked to the government's advantage. When the official story started falling apart, what would the government rather the American people believe? That Nazi scientists were working for them at a secret base in New Mexico and experimenting on human children? I'll say it again, UFOs, space aliens visiting us, flying saucers are not being covered up. The UFOs are the cover-up. A cover-up that has positioned the global population to expect and even accept alien contact. And that is especially what someone somewhere needs for us to believe in order for them to cover up and to accomplish something else entirely. While most of the eyewitnesses and the vast majority of people with a television set believe that the Roswell crash was alien, the evidence suggests otherwise. Roswell was not an extraterrestrial event, it was a terrestrial event of Nazi UFOs, or experimental Nazi aircraft, and human experimentation. And that case only gets stronger as more researchers continue to bring forth more information. Again, use your favorite internet search engine. Type in Progeria. Type in Operation Paperclip. Type in Nazi UFO. And let your personal quest for the real cover-up begin. To quote Fox Mulder of TV's The X-Files, the truth is out there.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
In 1938, Reichstag President Hermann Göring, as head of the German Air Force, authorized an expedition to the Antarctic to conduct large-scale aerial surveys and scientific studies of a section of Queed-Maudland that the Germans would name New Swabia. Today, over 75 years later, many people still suspect the Nazis of having, 1, transported Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann, and Eva Braun by U-boat to Argentina, and then to New Swabia. 2, to having charted deep-lying warm-water tunnels suitable for secret U-boat navigation. 3, for having installed submarine ice pens in caverns along the Antarctic coast. And 4, for having erected launch pads for cutting-edge disc-shaped aircraft in still undetected sites. Moreover, unconfirmed reports state that the U.S. and U.K. forces sought out and destroyed Nazi forces in New Swabia. However far-fetched and unreasonable these suspicions may seem, sufficient grounds do exist to understand why it was and remains so difficult to end these persistent rumors. In an effort to debunk obvious falsehoods about the activities of the German Antarctic expedition of 1938 to 1939, researchers and government sources on occasion produce papers intended to demystify the matter. But to date, they have failed to put an end to the speculation and rumors. One such paper, the most recent and most thorough, written by Colin Summerhays and Peter Beeching, is now available. Regrettably, it fails in its intended purpose. In their honest endeavor to be as forthright and convincing as possible, the authors describe certain activities of the U.S. and U.K. governments pertaining to the German effort about which the general public had not hitherto been informed. Activities that had been deliberately kept secret from the public. And so this has only added to the suspicion.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
TBR writers have done a great job through the years of documenting for our magazine's readers the lesser known, the underreported, and sometimes completely unreported events of the Second World War. Included in this are the positive accomplishments, the criminal activities of both the Third Reich and of the Allies. The same writers have exposed scandals and cover-ups too numerous to recall. For every such article that has appeared in the magazine, several others were submitted, but were not chosen. Maybe there just wasn't enough room, or maybe the subject of the article simply did not harmonize with the other subjects covered in that issue. Such has been the case through the years when our writers have submitted articles on underreported topics such as the 1947 UFO crash near Roswell. I did the unthinkable a couple of years ago when I submitted an article on the all but completely unreported post-World War II experiments on human children conducted by Nazi scientists and housed with the full knowledge and funding of the U.S. government. Operation Paperclip. Historical events that deserve an honest discussion. But fitting them into the magazine, well, we could have done a special, we could have done a themed issue. But all of these things are just so out of the ordinary. And while I don't believe that the Nazis built a secret base on the dark side of the moon as was depicted in the 2012 sci-fi comedy Iron Sky, TBR writers do know that as early as the 1930s, the Nazis had technology that other nations of the world, including our own, would not successfully duplicate for several decades. In fact, many of the spacecraft depicted in the movie Iron Sky were inspired by actual craft that the Germans were developing before and during the war. It was the United States military's failed attempts at duplicating it that crashed in the desert in New Mexico in the summer of 1947. Obviously, that's a radically different scenario of what happened in Roswell than what you normally hear. And it would also explain why, for over 70 years now, the U.S. military has continued to cover it up. Perhaps the longest ongoing cover-up in our nation's history. As I admitted in that article, when I quoted the late Carl Sagan, who once said, "Fantastic claims require fantastic proof." Neither myself nor any of the other writers at TBR make any of our fantastic claims lightly. And we're always honest enough to admit that some of them lack the quote-unquote fantastic proof. In some cases, fantastic proof is just impossible to find. And maybe that is another reason why, through the years, the board of editors, of which I am a member, have ultimately made the decision when it comes to these articles on the subjects of which we've discussed in today's program, to pass on otherwise powerful articles that contain information that are deserving of a serious consideration. And so the decision was made, rather than to discuss these subjects in the magazine, to discuss them here on the radio today. It is our hope that you will continue to study them, that you will follow up with your own continued research, and that you'll do with this information a serious, deep dive of your own, so you can make up your mind for yourself. What exactly was the Nazi UFO program? What exactly happened at Roswell? Are thousands of Nazis secretly living in a base on the dark side of the moon? I don't think so. But the death ray of Star Wars might just be more fact than fiction. Anyways, we are out of time for today's TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. It is my hope that you will go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org, that you will check out the Barnes Review. And you will find out how you can become a subscriber to what is probably the greatest revisionist history magazine in print anywhere in the world today. Also, when you're at www.barnesreview.org, you can check out the archives of TBR Radio. Click the radio button, and you'll find the archives for TBR Radio. They go back for 2 or 3 years. They go back into the year 2018. And you can get the archives for this show, TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. And you can also watch the past broadcast of my other show, TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Show. And we also have archives for a podcast I've been doing for the past year, which is the Poor Boys Horology Podcast. I think you'll find all of them to be interesting and to contain some great listening material. When you're at www.barnesreview.org, go to the TBR bookstore. At the TBR bookstore, you can just find some great books. And those books make great gifts, as does a subscription to TBR Magazine. I can't think of a gift that I would rather receive, if I weren't already a subscriber, than a gift to TBR Magazine. For as little as $36, you can get a subscription, and you can get a year's worth of issues electronically delivered in PDF form. For $56, you can get both the PDF editions and the print version. Anyways, as we are running out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour, I would be remiss if I did not once again bring this matter up, because it is still sitting on the table. And that is that the legislature of Maryland has sent to Governor Hogan's desk a bill that would do away with the state song, Maryland, My Maryland. Governor Hogan is doing nothing with this bill. He thinks that if he'll just let it sit on his desk, let it pass by inaction on his part. He doesn't want to veto it because he said that he hates the state song. He doesn't want to sign it because that's political suicide. So he thinks that by just letting it sit on his desk and letting the clock expire, that the bill will be enacted, that the state song will be done away with, and that he will not have any political consequences in this matter. He'll be able to blame it all on the legislature. I need you to call Governor Hogan. His phone number is 410-974-3901. 410-974-3901. Let Governor Hogan know that it's his duty as the governor of Maryland to preserve and protect the history and heritage of the old line state. Tell him that you expect him to veto the legislation to do away with Maryland, My Maryland. And that if that legislation is enacted, either by his signature or by his inaction, that you will consider him personally responsible. Call 410-974-3901. Call Governor Larry Hogan and let him know that you expect him to veto this legislation. We are out of time, but don't worry, we will be back again next week. Same time, same place, we'll have another great show for you. If you're listening on YouTube or on Rumble, be sure to click like and subscribe. Those things really help the channel. Anyways, until next week, God bless.